Richard, thanks very much. Hope everyone's having a good morning after we had a great session last night and this morning as well. So what I want to do is talk about clinical trials and kind of what the pitfalls and caveats are in digital health, because this is a whole new beast. And we really are trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and we've learned a lot. So I want to talk about general issues, some of the lessons we've learned at Stanford with our initiatives, and hopefully there'll be some time for discussion. These are my disclosures. Everyone here knows this. Digital health investment is skyrocketing, but the reason I'm putting this slide up is that in 2014, digital health investment in the Valley took over medical device funding. So we went from pharma to medical device for early exits, high, rapid valuation, the usual strategies for growth. Then came digital health, and there's more money there than we have in traditional medical devices. So the whole industry of pharma and device trials has now put their attention on digital health and trying to do things here. Why do we need clinical trials in digital health? We sort of know all this. Feasibility, utility, validity, safety, efficacy. Those are kind of the cornerstones of any therapy or any intervention in a healthcare system that you'd want to prove. These trials also give you societal acceptance, and in that I include regulatory acceptance if that's applicable. It also gives you patient acceptance. This patient's getting a rectal exam, right? So there is societal acceptance here. And clinical trials establish this. If you don't have evidence for a colonoscopy, why would you do it? There's also clinical acceptance. So this is across multiple stakeholders, whether it be clinicians, caregivers, and professional societies like the AHA, of course. And of course, we need evidence for payer acceptance, and this is a hurdle many of you are facing right now. So whether that's Medicare, whether it's fee-for-service, whether it's integrated healthcare systems, or whether it's employer-based insurance programs where you're doing population health management with a strategy of going to the employer, you need data. The other interesting issue with clinical trials in the digital health world is there's a real blur between efficacy and effectiveness. We think of effectiveness as sort of what's going on in the real world, and we think of trials as efficacy. But when you're looking at healthcare system interventions, you've really blurred those lines. So if you look at digital health, the real problems are less about societal acceptance, although that is an issue, but really more about the latter two, clinical and payer acceptance. And I said you blur the lines here between efficacy and effectiveness. Additionally, there's sort of the pain points that you have to prove can go away or can be addressed, whether it be implementation or EMR integration, if that's applicable. So you don't have to go through these pain point strategies in traditional pharma and device clinical trials. That's just par for the course. But as many of you know, this is cornerstone to adoption in our field. So this is the traditional pharma framework for a regulatory phase 3 pivotal study. Many of you in the audience work for companies like this. You know this. You start with an investigational new drug. It goes through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's animal studies, human studies, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic, toxicity studies. The pivotal study, so to speak, is the big mega trial usually in cardiology. It's the phase 3 trial. You put in your new drug application. You wait for the FDA panel, and if it all goes well, you get approved. If you look below here, you look at the attrition rate. You screen 5,000 to 10,000 compounds or in drug discovery, and maybe one gets approved. So the portfolio for R&D is very, very large to get to a viable therapy that gets launched. The problem here is this completely doesn't work in digital health. Digital health doesn't have a high barrier to entry. In traditional pharma, you do. The endpoints are not controversial in traditional trials because you've negotiated those with the FDA. And the other important thing is you can't iterate in the traditional way. If you have a drug in phase 1, that's what you're testing in phase 3. You can't change the dose once you measure. Whereas with apps and interventions, we are always tweaking them. So how do you incorporate that in a traditional trial approach? As part of that, your minimum viable product in pharma is the final product, and that's not true in digital health. So how do you reconcile this to the mold of clinical trials? So the barrier to entry issue is big because there's a lot of people out there who have great ideas and even early stage concepts, and you establish validity just from ideation. Feasibility has taken the tech approach, well, if we get users to sign up, it must be feasible. Not sure that's really the evidence you have. But the regulatory barriers don't apply, and as you know, the acceptance is not based on pharma pathways, whether it be pharmacologic or predication based on a 510K for medical devices, unless you happen to have a medtech medical device and you're going that route. The other issues that are kind of blurred, as you know, is the issue of who is the customer, who is the payer, and who is the stakeholder. They don't completely align in a traditional pharma and device setting. So let's kind of go through Trials 101. Here's the gold standard. You randomize, you double blind, so that's the person, you don't know which intervention is being received by the patient, you don't know which you're sending to them, right? So you're blinded on both sides. There's something called double dummy. So if they have a pharma placebo-controlled trial, an ideal situation is both patients get drug A and drug B, but one is a placebo and one is not, and they're randomized, so that way you can't game the system. Remember, in the physician's health study of physicians, aspirin was not associated with improvement of outcomes, and one of the major reasons is the physicians used a urine analysis dipstick, and if the pH was low, it was acetylsalicylic acid. They could tell if they had a placebo or not. So when they accounted for crazy physicians enrolled in trials, you now had a positive result. So this is why blinding and placebo control is traditionally important. With traditional trials, you have a single discrete outcome, death, heart attack, other things. And in the way we design these studies, they're what we call event-driven. You stop at some points when you meet your statistical boundaries. You don't have to continue every patient. So they all can have variable degrees of follow-up based on the exposure. And why can you get away with that in a traditional pharma trial? It's the concept of proportional hazards. So if you're taking a drug, such as an anticoagulant, you're getting a proportional effect or benefit every day you take it. There isn't a synergistic effect that if you took it for 30 straight days versus 90 straight days, that the 90 is inherently better above and beyond the linear increase in its duration. And the same is true of efficacy. Obviously, you get older and you may accrue comorbidities. But the issue of proportional hazards may not apply in digital health interventions, where the intervention may be given upstream and you're really looking for behavior change downstream. So why is randomization important? I do observational research, and I can tell you the potential benefits of pseudo-randomization and taking observational data, but the fundamental problem with taking real-world data and trying to infer cause out there, or I would go even further and say to expect treatment decisions like we discussed yesterday that you can machine learn from observational data, is that the data is flawed to do that. The problem with observational data is that the treatment selection, what a patient in the real world actually received, is informed by factors that are usually tied to both the predictor and the outcome. And you often don't know what those are. Stents versus coronary bypass. Using real-world data is very hard because somebody got a stent for a reason and somebody got coronary bypass for a reason. And it wasn't a flip of a coin. Your doctor didn't flip a coin and decide what they wanted to give you. There were other factors, and you can control for that only to some extent. But if you haven't identified those factors, you can't control for them. So the same is true with anticoagulation, and the same is true of exercise and diet. You have to be well enough to comply or even with those therapies. So the problem with observational data, whether it's traditional biostatistics, whether it's machine learning, whether it's deep learning, is that you can't prove causation. And for certain use cases, you don't need to. But the problem is this is statistically inferred at best, and I'll talk about why that's a problem. The other issue with the data science approach of mining tons of data and trying to deep learn is the issue of missingness, and we don't talk about this enough. The problem is that patients who have complete and incomplete healthcare system data are fundamentally different. Okay, so you can't just take every creatinine from a real-world data set and expect to find something. In many studies, it's not the lab result, but the intensity of testing that actually is a bigger determinant of outcomes because they were getting tested for a reason. So this is the problem with observational data and causal inference. You can, however, be creative in your approach to randomization, and these are some new techniques that have emerged in what are called pragmatic or point-of-care trials, and one such approach is cluster randomization. This is when you don't randomize at the patient level, but you actually randomize sites, clinic A versus clinic B. And what you then might do is cross them over, and that's a cluster crossover design. So you might employ a digital health intervention in clinic A and then cross them over at some point after a, quote, washout period, and do the same with clinic B. And this is a very useful strategy for implementation studies and digital health trials, and we're seeing more and more of these. The other benefit is if there's really true equipoise, and you're not exposing the patient to any meaningful risk, you may not need patient-level consent, and you can get by without that. That's huge for many reasons. One is efficiency, one is cost, one is study duration. Many, many reasons. And the other is it's a real-world study. It's an effectiveness study, not of highly selected patients who you were able to consent for your trial. So there are some problems with cluster crossover. If you were doing a study of the flu vaccine with an injection versus an inhaled mixed, and everyone got, all the clusters, all the sites got randomized to giving the injection during flu season and got randomized to giving the inhaled mist during the summer months, you might falsely conclude that the inhaled mist is more effective at preventing flu. So you can't stack the randomization in any way that could cause potential bias, including time trends. So there's complex designs where these are called stepped wedge designs, where you actually stagger the way these interventions start and cross over. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the number of sites. And you can even randomize these wedge designs as well. The idea here is that you try to account for every possible thing, including time as a confounder. So let's talk about more issues in digital health. Blinding. How do you blind? You can't. It's very difficult to blind someone to a digital health intervention because the point is to offer it. Well, in that case, what about co-intervention? So let's say you do a randomized trial of an app or a coaching system, and the or participant consents, and they got randomized to not using it. And they say, fine, I'm going to go to the iTunes App Store, and I'm going to download something else. How do you handle that? What if the control group now gets more motivated? Well, screw it. I don't have that intervention, and I don't get to get those cool wearables at my house, so I'm just going to go to Best Buy and buy them myself, or I'm going to do better. These are real issues of contamination and treatment crossover. And in that setting, what is the appropriate control? Is it usual care? Is it in place of usual care? Do you add it onto usual care? And this is one that is starting to get some discussion, is do you create dumb apps or sham apps, a dumbed-down version? And this really goes to what it is you're trying to test. If you're trying to test an overall approach as a strategy, it may not make sense to do the sham app. But if the idea is to see if there are certain parts of an app, such as you've now modified your app to do deep learning and you need regulatory approval for that, well, of course it makes sense in that case to have a stripped-down version of the app to avoid contamination from other things related to engagement. How long should the study be? We heard about burn rates earlier today. You can't have a 3-year study. It's going to cost too much. How much do you need to prove to stakeholders that it's going to work? And again, we talked about these proportional hazards. So here's sort of the overall conceptual framework in digital health that I think has emerged. This is not the only way to think about it, but we like to think that you can measure engagement in the next few weeks. You can get behavior change and behavior outcomes in the few months to follow. And if you wait long enough, you should have clinical improvement. What's really interesting about this, if you do quality research, is this actually fits a quality framework that's been used in health services research for a long time, where you look at the care structure. What is the care they're getting? What are the sites doing? Are there cath labs at that site? Is there a cath lab accessible within 30 minutes for pre-hospital care? You look at the process. Are they getting the ECG in 10 minutes? Are they getting that door-to-balloon time in 90 minutes? And then you look at the outcomes for rehospitalization, severity of MI, 30-day, 90-day, or long-term outcomes and mortality. It's a very, very parallel framework here. The problem is we haven't yet proven definitively that this thing happens in the time spans that we're allocating. So even if you did a 3 to 6 month trial and you looked at meaningful changes in behavior as assessed by adherence or a drop in LDL, we still don't know what happens 5 years post healthcare intervention. And that's a problem. And again, it has to do with this issue of dose effect and proportional hazards. For better or for worse, for a lot of drugs, we assume that the benefit only occurs when you're on it, such as an anticoagulant, so you may not need that 20-year trial. But it gets more complicated for medical devices like defibrillators, which can have problems that arise later. We heard a little bit about engagement as an outcome. Well, let's talk about what I think engagement is not. Engagement is not how many times you open the app, how many times you look at the app, how many times you click it, how many times you like or retweet. It doesn't work. There's no meaningful connection here. But what we do know is that there are validated measures of engagement, such as this survey, the patient activation measure. Many of you have used this in trials or have seen it. And this does assess a patient or participant's knowledge and skill in managing one's health and healthcare. And there's sort of a conceptual framework of levels of engagement, starting from being disengaged or overwhelmed, and going all the way through. And I'm not a behavioral scientist, but there are many reasons this happens. What we do know is that the PAM score does predict future ER visits, hospital admissions, and readmissions and adherence. But the problem with engagement is that it's endogenous. And what I mean by that is, this is what we like to think. This is sort of the digital health Kool-Aid that we all drink, including myself. The problem is we don't account for this, right? It's the healthy behavior that can facilitate engagement, right? So it's reverse causation. And the same is true of going to the gym and fitness. You have to be well enough and healthy enough to go to the gym. So if you did an observational study of people who go to the gym and people who don't, you know what you're going to find. They're not randomized. So this is another reason that observational data is insufficient, because it cannot account for the magnitude of the arrow going in the other direction. And that's very, very important. So the only way to really get around this, to look at treatment effect, is to randomize and look pre and post in both arms with engagement to see if there's a true difference. So I'm going to walk through a couple examples of trials, some that we're doing, some that have not worked, and kind of go through the exercise of why. So before we had these, we had implantables. I'm a cardiac electrophysiologist, so I put in a lot of these. These are pacemakers and defibrillators. And the interesting thing is digital health existed in the world of implantable devices long before we got wearables. We have remote monitoring from the patient's nightstand through any wireless modality of your choice, cell, internet, landline. I guess that's non-wireless. We get the data, we look at it, and that's it. If you look at observational data, this looks great. This is, it's hard to see the graphs, but it shows that patients who there was a dose-dependent effect in the intensity of remote monitoring of these devices. So extend the analogy of digital health and engagement and wellness coaching to this just for a second. And what this tells you is, okay, if my patients are remotely monitored, they do better. So just on observational data alone, this became a quality measure because it's probably a good thing, even though you couldn't prove causation. But a couple weeks ago, this trial came out. This is the first randomized trial of remote monitoring in patients with heart failure who received a specific type of implantable device called a cardiac resynchronization therapy device that has a defibrillator, CRTD. And this is used to improve heart failure and to prevent sudden death. 8 sites, multi-center, truly randomized. Outcome was death and cardiovascular hospitalization. No difference. Randomization showed no difference. So where is truth? Are these a highly selected population? Is this something that's only unique to Europe? Does this not generalize to the US? Is the US data more like the observational study? And these are the challenges when you have conflicting levels of evidence with randomized trials in observational studies. So the best you can hope for is that you do the RCT and you do it well to give confirmation. This is hard to see, but what is interesting is that it did reduce healthcare utilization, particularly ER visits. So there was proof of causation that patients stayed out of the ER with remote monitoring. And that's a very viable, reasonable, legitimate outcome that payers would say, okay, we're going to continue to reimburse for remote monitoring. Eric Topol did the Wired for Health study. This was an interesting study, one of the first of its kind. Prospective trial looking at healthcare utilization and 3 sensors. A blood pressure cuff, a glucometer that's no longer on the market, and first generation one of a LiveCore. He randomized 65 in each arm, control as usual care. No difference, look at the p-values. There's no difference in dollars, visits, anything, or even measures of patient activation, that PIM score that I mentioned, nothing. So why did this happen? Maybe the trial was too short. Maybe the paradigm of data collection wasn't there. There was no passive data connection. Perhaps this was not integrated with care coordination, the real issue of engagement. Maybe it's the wrong patients. Some of these patients were what I would call smartphone naive. You know, you may not know where your children are, but all of you know how much charge is on your phone right now, I can assure you. It's that kind of behavior you have of your phone and the way you interact with it that really has to be there before you start loading on digital health interventions to patients who are overwhelmed or have comorbidities. And the other issue is we talk about how all smartphones are everywhere and the elderly are using them and even middle age and everything. The problem is, this is from The Economist, from Ofcom, and what you can see here is in red, yes, patients above the age of 55 are using these, but they weren't using it in the same level of intensity as a 16 to 34 population. So not all smartphone use or possession of smartphone is the same. And this is going to affect and attenuate an intervention result. The other issue is design. I mean, this was the data that was handed to patients in this trial without coaches, without engagement. And this is really not the right way, I would argue, that you want patients to look at data. So you have to go through that and really think of a cleaner way of showing your data. This is the screenshots from the AliveCore app. And I think this one is also important, and the crowd here knows this, but a lot of doctors don't. You can't list your iPhone as your primary care physician as a line from this New Yorker comic. Seth Martin and a group at Hopkins did a systematic review looking at mHealth for improving medication adherence. Again, we all know adherence is low-hanging fruit, and we talked about it yesterday. These are the trials. The details are not important, but they found 6 trials related to cardiovascular adherence, and they concluded the trials were really not well done, not enough quality, and that you need high-quality clinical trials of sufficient size and duration to move the field forward. So there is a clinical statement here that the trial and the evidence base isn't good enough. Is this going to be a phase 3 pharma mega trial? No, and it doesn't need to be. But these small pilots that are often used to add value to a company's milestone history is really not, they're not often designed to get stakeholder acceptance. And that may be okay, that may be the overall strategy, but you sometimes need more to advance the field. And this is from Eric Topol's paper, and they had a lot of challenges, and these are the whole issue of public-partner partnerships. They had 5 departments at Scripps, 10 companies, 8 contracts with legal agreements just to move and get this going. We have to figure out how to do this better. So I'll talk about AFib very briefly. AFib, everyone here knows, is a big problem, 3 to 5 million patients currently. Payers care because it's expensive. Anticoagulation is a problem. I mean, these are sort of all things that are well known in the field of cardiovascular disease and a major priority for the American Heart Association. And we know that if patients don't take their anticoagulants, regardless of which one it is, bad things happen. We also did a study that was published last year that showed that, at least in the VA, the adherence issue was not a patient-level issue only, it was a site level. So you had sites where adherence was high, sites where adherence was low. So we thought, well, maybe this means that anti-coag clinics should be managing them, because we found that anti-coag clinic management for the novel oral anticoagulants that don't actually need it and need the lab testing like warfarin, maybe they should be rolled in. The problem outside the VA and many systems is there's no reimbursement. So if you're Geisinger, Kaiser, VA, that's great, but if you're out of those systems, there's no reimbursement. So we wanted to iterate, and we have a trial called SMARTED here that we're running out of Stanford, which is a randomized trial to look at adherence, and it's similar in design of many, but it's bigger. It's up to 500 patients across 50 sites, and you need to own a smartphone to participate. We'll look at adherence in both arms. This is randomized, and we're going to look at their refills. We're going to get medical permission to contact their pharmacy. We're going to be counting their pills. We're going to do it the real way. In a lot of adherence studies, they're looking at adherence by engagement of the app, by what you press. You have no control group. You really don't know if it's making a difference. We're also doing a large study to screen for undiagnosed AFib. This came up yesterday. This is a huge priority, both in the public health sector and in industry. We've done a study estimating 500,000 patients who have undiagnosed AF. And what's different about our study is we're looking at point of care. What if we identified the right patients, eventually using clinical decision support, and right there, they got a wearable sensor to detect AF. In order to do this, you need to scale it, and you need to start with a pilot showing proof of concept, feasibility, and in this case, a diagnostic yield. So the other thing, which we talked about burn, this is intended to be done from first patient in to last patient out in about a year. So we get that people need to move, and that's a big area. Other areas we're looking at is post-PCI, cardiac rehab. We all know cardiac rehab is underused. There's a few companies here about this. And in the world of cardiology, angioplasty and stenting is a disease and management inflection point. You've got to take drugs that are new, and if you don't, your stents can clot and you can die. You have to start risk factor modification that's very aggressive. And we'll, again, look at a digital health intervention and coaching. And this is one example of such an intervention called Brightheart, and the CEO is here. But this is the one we intend to use. And again, it's not about the app. It's about the coaching around it and having behavior change so that these patients do the right thing. But the key is randomization. We're going to do something similar for post-AFib ablation. This is an unmet need because there are actually no great quality measures for AFib outside of anticoagulation right now. And readmission after AFib ablation is quite common. AFib is on the chopping block for a bundled payment, so fee for value is going to be a big deal in the AF space. And we're working with Intermountain Healthcare to actually go from ground zero, develop the intervention, see what apps and wearables we want, pilot the integration, implement it using one of these step wedge designs, and see what happens. So again, this is what we need to do. And we've been very fortunate at Stanford to really be able to do this. Ken Mahaffey runs the Stanford Center for Clinical Research, and we have a digital health coordinating center there. And he's done a tremendous job scaling up the SCCR. It has 40 employees now in a very short time, 1.5 to 2 years. And we really have kind of, I think, paved the way, at least at our institution, on how we do this stuff. Managing sites, making sure these sites, if they were a high enroller for a study drug, that's one thing. But can they really handle a digital health trial? Figuring out e-consent, onboarding, and a lot of stuff. The key, though, to do a trial correctly is the last bullet, governance and accountability. You really want to have a steering committee and data safety monitoring, no matter how small your trial. It's not that hard to set up, but it shows that you, as a sponsor or as a company of the study, had sufficient distance from the operations. That's very important. There was a major paper in electrophysiology that was retracted last week and caused considerable controversy. And the issue is, was there a steering committee? Was there DSM monitoring? Those things are very important. So I'm going to stop soon, but I want to just get through the last few slides. We deal with this, right? It's a painful reality, but remember that we know what happens when you go that route. Disruption with impunity will not sustain. You have to do this right. You have to factor this in. You don't want to end up in this situation. And because of that, what's been so great is the way academic collaboration has evolved. Stanford was a place historically known for people working in silos. Under a lot of leadership change, especially with Bob Harrington coming, that's changed. We're collaborative, we're multidisciplinary. Of course, we work with other universities, but where we are now is kind of version 3, working with our professional societies like the AHA, working with companies that are entering tech or not really, in healthcare, like shown here as well. Lockheed Martin makes electronic health records. I had no idea. The Google baseline, again, is one partnership study as well. That's a longitudinal study, multidisciplinary, and I think you will hear more about that. And remember, the other part of this is that you can make trials more efficient with digital health. So if you have a traditional trial, Lilly, pharma company, is actually trying to get patients to participate in clinical studies off of Twitter feeds. This somehow came on my Twitter feed, so I took a screenshot. We're trying to do some of this stuff at a new Center for Digital Health that we have at Stanford, where we are really thinking hard about designing, working, and our goal really is just to advance digital health through meaningful collaboration, whether it's on the research side, advising, or education, and these are some of the things that we do. And as we said, that really what we want to be is kind of that front door for many of the initiatives we have at Stanford, and we work very closely with Ken Mahaffey and the Stanford Center for Clinical Research. Our operations director, Sharmeen Nasrallah, is in the audience today. So I'm going to summarize and end here. Randomized trials are the highest level of evidence and may be necessary to compel stakeholders. I really believe that the trial should be robust in design and execution. You can do these on the cheap, but you want to kind of really think through and really assess the incremental cost of doing it well. Think strategically about your evidence story and what the longitudinal development is of your evidence base. You may not need that trial up front to get customers, but again, factor this into your fundraising and burn, and of course, engage your stakeholders early. Bob Harrington, my colleague Sumbul Desai, and I had a piece in JAMA Cardiology about digital health, and I have more about trials in here if you're interested. Thank you.